Please join me in welcoming Kathleen Walkup.
Hi, everybody. Thanks for coming, especially on this day, which seems like you could be more gainfully employed dressed up like Santa Claus and doing a pub crawl. So it's very nice to have you here. We sort of hoped that a few Santas might make it into the audience, but that doesn't seem to be happening. So I also, of course, want to thank Lisa Dunseth and the Public Library staff, including two techs, one of whom is back there behind the camera, Kenny, whose last name I don't know, but thank you very much for being here and for inviting me to give this lecture. It's really great to see so many friends in the audience. It feels really quite lovely. Talking about printing at the margins, and I'm looking at the history of women involved in the printing trade and craft. Now, that history is as long and as deep as the history of printing itself. It's just not quite as well documented. So one of my interests is in trying to provide a little bit more information about that. And I'm planning on focusing on women in the craft and trades and less on women in the private press and hobby movements. Nuns were involved with books before the advent of printing, just as monks were. This wonderful, we know about this partly because even though they were doing this for the greater glory of God, some of them could not, both monks and nuns, could not resist putting their images in their manuscripts. So this is one of my favorites. This is Gouda, and she wrote around her portrait, Gouda, a sinner, wrote and painted this book. The other one that I'm very fond of is Claricia, who's drawn herself as coming off the tail of the queue in one of her illuminated letters. But to carry on the practice of nuns making books, the nuns at San Jacopo di Ripoli in Italy, in Florence, actually are the first women that we know about who started printing. And they were active from about 14, do I have it up there? I've forgotten the dates now. About 1476 to 1484. And they actually printed over 80 books. Now, we probably should think about what that means when we say that they printed the books. They were a cloistered order, but most likely they didn't actually print the books. And we'll see in a little bit why that might not have been very practical given the technology of the time. But what they did do was do all the typesetting. And we are quite certain that they were involved in the typesetting of the books. This particular book is a Donatus. That is actually, we can see in the colophon their statement about doing the book. This book you can actually see at the Bancroft. These are taken, this was actually slides taken from the copy at the Bancroft, which we're very lucky to have. By the 16th century, we have several women who were actually shop owners who were running presses. That is to say, who were running the business of the press. The most well-known is probably Charlotte Goddard. She was a 16th century French woman who married a printer. He died. She married his journeyman, which was fairly standard practice to keep the business in the family. He died, and I think at that point she just decided, the heck with it, I'm just going to do this myself. And so she did continue to print for 54 years under her own imprint. She printed over 150 titles and is known as the most important businesswoman in 16th century France as a consequence of what she did. It's a little hard to even imagine what was involved here in somebody being a shop owner, because at that time she would not only have had the shop to run, but it was her responsibility to feed and house all of the workers that worked at the press, so that she basically was running a boarding house on the top of the print shop, which was standard practice. She never did have children, but she supported many nieces and nephews, so she was a very, very successful businesswoman. This book, The Saint Jerome, The Life of Saint Jerome, is a book that is actually, this is Mill's copy of the book. Saint Jerome is a woman's saint at that time, and so this was a book that possibly was, Goddard printed very broadly most books in Latin. This happens to be in French, but she may have printed the book, we don't know this, for the sort of women's market. What we do know is that we have this wonderful inscription in the Mill's copy that actually indicates that not only was the book printed by a woman, it was owned by a woman, and it was passed on by that woman to her niece. So it really has a wonderful provenance. If we go into the 18th century, just galloping ahead a little bit here, we do have quite a bit of evidence about women in the printing trades. In this particular case, this is, of course, from the famous Dido Encyclopedia, and here we have two women who are cleaning up the type but obviously working in the type foundry. So we can see through that encyclopedia the gendered practices of various trades or crafts that were associated with printing, including type founding, printing itself, and of course, much more so where we'll see women would be in paper making and, of course, in binding, where women have been involved and had been involved since the Guild movement in the Middle Ages. I'm hoping that my remote just seems to have conked out. So sorry about that. So technology is great when it's working, and when it stops working, it's too bad. What I do want to spend a little bit of time on is just looking at the American colonial period, because that is a time when we see a surprising number of women that are involved in the printing trades. The very first book that was printed on North American soil is this book, which is called the Bay Psalm Book. It was printed in about 1940. 1640, sorry, and went through several different printings, probably sold something like 1,700 copies before, which was quite a lot of copies at that point when people were very liable to only own one book, if that. But what's so interesting about this book is that this book is always referred to either as the Bay Psalm Book, meaning after the Massachusetts Bay Colony, or as being printed from the press of Stephen Day. In fact, the Bay Psalm Book was printed from the press of Elizabeth Glover. Elizabeth Glover was made a widow on a trip coming to America from England. Her husband died en route, and they were bringing a press to Cambridge, and she continued with the press and set it up in Cambridge next to where Harvard was just going to be coming into being, and actually saw that these books were printed, that this Bay Psalm Book was printed. You virtually never read about that in any of the history books, because the book is always referred to as having been printed by Stephen Day. Now, Stephen Day was a locksmith who may or may not have printed the book, but what you have here is an instance where the only instance that I know of where they talk about a book as being from the press of the printer rather than the press owner. And so you have to think that that is a consequence of her being a woman. This is the Wikipedia entry, which is a good reason never to trust Wikipedia. This is the translation that they make of the title page. And if you actually look closely there, you can see that they're saying Cambridge, Massachusetts, Stephen Day, by the way, spelled D-A-Y instead of D-A-Y-E. But nowhere on this title page does it even say that. So how they're managing to translate that is completely beyond me. So there's something to be careful about. But this is a sort of ubiquitous way of thinking about the Bay Psalm book. One of the women who printed during the colonial era, and there were about somewhere between 2 and 3 dozen women press owners at that time, was a woman named Mary Catherine Goddard. She and her mother actually had a press that they were able to keep, even though neither one of them was a printer's widow, because her brother William had a press at one point, and the two, Sarah's, the mother, and her son split off, and Sarah and Mary Catherine continued to print. Of course, there was a very strong reason for not taking the means of livelihood away from widows or single women or sisters, because if even though they weren't allowed to own their own property, if you took away the means of livelihood, then you become a ward of the state, basically, along with the children that these women would have. So these women were allowed to run businesses. And of course, we do get the sense that there was a bit of a sort of frontier mentality during the colonial period that allowed some of this to go on. Many of these women ended up being official printers of the various colonies, which of course had a huge need for all those kinds of papers and documents and exciting things that needed to be printed by sort of new states. Mary Catherine actually printed the first official Declaration of Independence, the first official state of the Declaration of Independence. And down there at the bottom, I know you can't see it, but there's a little colophon that indicates that that she was the official printer. Lydia Bailey was another. She was an official printer of Philadelphia, and she supposedly, on her own, of course, is again a widow. She supported 4 children. She paid off all of her husband's debts, and she lived to the age of 90. So she printed 50 years after her husband died, which is absolutely amazing. Another printer one that I'm particularly interested in or fond of maybe is Anne Franklin. Anne Franklin was the wife of Ben's brother James. Now, James was not a very happy printer. This was not something that he particularly wanted to do. He was rather forced into doing this. So when he died, Anne, who seemed to really care a great deal about printing, kept the business alive again. She had a very, I'm just going to see if I can angle this so I don't have to. Is this going to come apart if I'm, okay. It just, this is, she did the kinds of printing that you would expect to see at the colony. She was the official printer for Rhode Island, so she was printing the charters and all of that kind of work. Every printer had to have an almanac. If you had one book in your house, it would be a Bible or a psalm book or some kind of religious book. If you had 2, the other one would be an almanac. So they were bestsellers during the colonial period. By the way, no Bibles were printed on colonial soil during the colonial period, which is surprising, right? Because you'd think that would be the first book that everybody would print. The British government created a situation that said it was illegal to print the Bibles on colonial soil, and the reason was, of course, that it was such a bestseller that they would lose money. So all Bibles had to be imported during the colonial period. So what the printers did was they printed a lot of other underground literature as well, of course, but they also printed their almanacs, which were their bestsellers. Anne Franklin also printed little fiction like light novels, and and in this case, this is the only copy left from the American Antiquarian Society of a book called Fair Rosamond, but it's very likely that Anne herself carved the little woodblock that's on the cover of the book. Anne's daughters, we know, were very, quote, quick and correct at case. These were two young women who were documented by the famous colonial historian and printer Isaiah Thomas, who noted that there were women typesetting at this time, although, again, very, very unlikely to be printing. This is why. When we're talking about printing during this time period from Gutenberg on to the beginning of the 19th century, this is the kind of press on the left that would have been used. It's a wooden press, it's a wooden hand press, very badly leveraged, very hard to operate, and needing a pretty decent amount of physical strength in order to make it work. There's a reason why all the images of the actual pressmen during that time have shoulders like this. And I think it probably wasn't very interesting work either to just pull the lever for 12 or 14 hours a day. That's a bit of a fanciful interpretation, a kind of Norman Rockwell-esque interpretation, obviously from a later time period of what a colonial era print shop could have looked like. But what is not going to change during this time period and well into the 19th century is the idea of typesetting. Type was being set by hand in this kind of type stick from metal type, from lead type. It's what Gutenberg invented, is the idea of movable type, and this is what was carried into the 19th century as the only way of creating typesetting. And it's worth thinking about when we think about women attached to the idea of printing. I believe that there's really a different, also a sort of maybe a little bit romantic connection, but I think that one of the reasons that women were so attracted to being in the printing trades and the printing craft was the connection with language and was the implicit suggestion of literacy. In other words, you're going to be literate if you're going to set type. So it seems as if you're working toward a higher goal in a way, and I think that connection is very, very important. We definitely see this in the middle of the 19th century. We have a situation where women are the life for women, particularly, and I'm thinking about middle class women here more so than working class women or the rising middle class. We have a situation where capitalism, the rise of capitalism and mechanization is really changing the whole nature of cultural life and domestic life. So if we think about 1860, about the middle of the 19th century, several things came together. First of all, there was a certain absence of men in the workforce in England and America because of the Crimean and Civil Wars. That also meant that there was an absence of potential husbands for women. There was a rising cost of keeping women at home because now you had to buy stuff instead of make it. And so if you're moving out of the domestic, home-based economy, somebody's got to pay for this stuff, the cloth that you're buying now instead of weaving yourself. So women that would have normally stayed at home as single women, daughters, were being pushed out of the house because they really couldn't. The house couldn't support them. And then, of course, as we move into industrialization, we'll find two things. We'll see some labor that men feel is beneath them to do, or that they would rather not do, and we also start to see employers that are looking for ways to save money, in other words, cheap labor. But what we're seeing here with Emily Faithfull, she was a woman that was involved with the Society for the Protection of Employment for Women, which unfortunately was called SPEW. But she a kind of sad acronym, what can I say? But Faithfull was looking for a way to try to establish some gainful employment for this disenfranchised class of white middle-class women who were no longer really able to stay at home and be supported at home. However, they also because of their class, because of their background, they needed work that was seemly, that was appropriate. And of course, what many of them were trying to do was to be governesses, totally untrained, but that was a seemly employment, but there are a limit to how many governesses you can have. Milliners would have been another kind of area, or seamstresses. And what Faithfull decided was that printing would be a very noble endeavor for women to work at that time. And she was able to get the funding together to start a press called the Victoria Press. Now, Faithfull herself had a lot of difficulty. One of the issues with her was she had, surprisingly for her time, she was a rather strident woman who was not afraid to indicate what her sexuality was. And she ended up in a huge scandal because she got caught in an affair with a married person. The only problem was that the married person was not a man, but a woman. So a lot of her very hard work was heavily discounted by the fact that the husband of this woman, in order to save face, took her to court and made a very public spectacle of her, which was a very unfortunate situation. However, she did start Victoria Press in 1860, which had women did all the compositing. She also had very forward-looking ideas about labor. She insisted that women be allowed to have stools to sit on to typeset, that they did not have to just stand in front of the case all day in their long, heavy dresses. She insisted on proper meal breaks and tea breaks, and she actually lobbied very hard for the 8-hour workday, which is kind of extraordinary in 1860. So she did some very good work. The kinds of books, though, that they were going to print there in periodicals at the Victoria Press had to be appropriate to the women standing who were working there. So what they did was did a lot of work that they considered genteel. So that this was an example. This was an example of a chromolithograph book that was undertaken by, they were not literally printed there at the press, but published by the Victoria Press, with chromolithographs by Emily's sister, Esther Faithfull Fleet. And this would have been the kind of appropriate material that would be published. They published the Victoria magazine, which was a very standard-looking magazine of the day. Faithfull, I don't know how she could possibly have even slept, because the amount of writing that she did for that magazine was just breathtaking. So a great deal of the writing that was going on was Faithfull's. In the 1870s, she made 3 visits to America, and in that book, she published a book about it later called 3 Visits to America, and she does talk a little bit about some of the situations that she encountered when she was trying to start the Victoria Press. In one section, she says that the girl apprentices were subject to all kinds of annoyances. Their frames and stools were covered with ink. Their type cases were emptied of sorts. The cases were mixed up and dumped in together by any man who was actually working on the premises, made it very difficult for the apprentices to be able to work. She said that the men who came into the office to work the presses, because the women were not working the presses, and teach the girls had to assume false names to avoid detection. In 1879, the London Society of Compositors would only send men to presses that guaranteed that said compositor would not be called on to assist the females in any way. Further, no man should ever be allowed to touch work that was handled by women and stay in the London Society of Compositors. So that was the situation that Faithfull was describing in 1879, which meant that she was dealing with the very, very strong typographical union, or typographical unions, which we're going to see throughout the entire 19th and well into the 20th century. There's going to be difficulty between the union holding on to the privilege of that work and women trying to penetrate into the work, with the employer in the middle, whose bottom line is really the interest, and the employer would really, not surprisingly, we still know about this, didn't really have too much time for union representation. What they wanted to do was bring in the cheapest labor. And so they were claiming to be championing women, but in fact, of course, they just wanted cheap labor. So as we move into the 19th century, we see a huge difference in the way presses looked. We've now got steam-driven presses that are printing from rolls of paper, because paper is now made on a big web starting at the very end of the 18th century. So we've got a whole different scale of going on here. And so when we're thinking about women moving into the printing trades during this time, we think about where they fit within this framework. So one place they fit is with the very unskilled jobs. So in this case, the job of the type rubber is literally someone who is just scraping off the just recently cast type and getting rid of all of the little shavings. We have a typographic casting expert in our audience who can describe this process later if you need to know about it. So that would be one kind of unskilled labor. But one of the places where the women were very, very widely employed was as press feeders. In this case, you have these large presses which still don't have automatic feed systems, so you're printing on large sheets of paper if you're not printing on a web on the roll, and those sheets have to be guided into the bed of the press to be printed on the type. So this is what the press feeder is going to do. This is the image from the poster. Unfortunately, the postcards for this talk never got printed, but this was would have been very nice to see, because this was the postcard. But I want to pause for a minute and take a look at this, because this is a little advertisement, if you will, for the position of press feeder. And so here's a couple of quotes from it. It says that this is a position for a young lady who has been tolerably well brought up and who dances her share of the polka with the best and proudest of her sex. In other words, sort of indicating that this is a job that these young, disenfranchised, single women who are no longer able to stay at home could do. And then it goes on to say, she guides the white, unsullied sheet into the complex, I'm quoting, into the complex mechanism whence it issues legible with the emotions of the human brain. But our press feeder is in a blessed state of ignorance of what she is doing, not the mechanical work itself, but the results of it. In other words, it's okay to send your daughter to do this because she can't see what's being printed. She's only dealing with these virginal sheets of paper, these clean, virginal sheets of paper that will leave her completely unsullied, because they could be printing the hugest rot at the other end, and they wouldn't know because they never see anything other than the white sheets. So this was the sales job for the press feeder. Unfortunately, it didn't quite work out that way. This was from another article. It says that the result of this work, which, by the way, could have been given to children before 1890, but evidently children were having trouble getting the sheets to feed straight, so otherwise they would have been doing this. The result was backbreaking work for young women who endured deplorable conditions and earned little pay. A passionate letter to the Post in 1882 described all that is left of what used to be the forms of 30 women. Fate and necessity combined forced them at an early age into the Bureau of Printing and Engraving. You see the result of stifling air and overheated rooms, standing on their feet for continuous hours while performing the most incessant labor. These women have given all the days of their youth and early womanhood to the service of the government, that is to say, in this Bureau of Engraving and Printing. And now, when they should be in the prime of their strength and usefulness, they are almost wrecked. This work was very, very hard. So it sounds, they make it sound as if this is something that a young woman of means and middle class could slip into, but the reality was far, far different. If we take a look at the sort of division of labor in about mid-19th century, this is now what's happened? There we go. Okay. At Harper Brothers, and I know these are probably a little bit hard to see. What we see is that this was I think I see there's a little blank in there. I apologize. That we see this press on its. This is a schematic, a cross section of the various floors, and if you can see it, you'll see that there's a very large gender division across most of it. So at the top we have the women who are press feeding with men, of course, because the men are actually doing the printing. We have the binders in the middle section, and at the bottom, in this case, we have the compositors, and at Harper Brothers in the mid-19th century, it was all men on that floor. But there were women who were very interested in doing more than just setting type. They also wanted to print. And one of the exciting places that we see that happening is actually right here in San Francisco. We had started in 1868. The Women's Cooperative Printing Union was founded by Agnes B. Peterson. She was an experienced compositor who came from the East, round the Panama Canal, with a child. She was a single mother by this time, assuming that she would be able to get work in San Francisco as a compositor, but nobody would hire her. And so she ended up managing to cobble together some money and opened up the Women's Cooperative Printing Union, where, as you can see here, women were not only typesetting, but they were also printing. In this case, not running the huge steam-driven presses that I showed you a few slides ago, but the more manageable individual presses called platen presses. In this case, treadle-fed, although often they would be attached to steam belts as well. And these presses were perfectly designed to print all of the kinds of things that a new capitalist economy needed. Business cards and letterheads and invoices and all of the kind of small things that were needed. And that's exactly what was going on at the Women's Cooperative Printing Union. I love this particular advertisement because it says, "Women set type, women run presses." And this was when Lizzy Richmond took over a couple of years after Agnes Peterson started the press. And Lizzy Richmond was quite a dynamic person who really moved the press into a very powerful and strong cooperative. Well, it wasn't ever a cooperative, it was an owner-operated press that did sort of move away from just employing women as they went along. Ultimately, the business was destroyed by fire in 1901. What was happening, though, at the same time with all of these other technological changes, is that something had to give with type. You can imagine the amount of printing that was going on in the mid-19th century, when every town would have had its daily newspaper, and every small village would have had at least a weekly newspaper, plus all of the other books and everything that were being done, and they were all being set by hand, just as Gutenberg had invented. A little bit. There were some refinements, but really not many. And so the 19th century was just this huge push to find a way to automate typesetting, and desperate need to do that. Mark Twain is said to have lost 2 fortunes trying to invest in failed typesetting machines. So as these machines were coming along, women were finding their space in that area where the typesetting was being developed. However, they were not particularly finding it generally by being hired to do the job. They were brought in almost always as strikebreakers. And so women would come in as strikebreakers, work for maybe half or less of what a man was being paid, but at least they were getting paid and they were training. So certain names pop out during this time, and one of them is Augusta Lewis. She was actually a very well-educated and rather well-to-do, from a rather well-to-do family, who started learning hand composition as a way to help support her journalistic career, and it was more something that she was really interested in. It was in 1867. She was 18, and she was considered very old to have start learning typesetting. That they said she was simply too old to be able to learn the trade. But learn it she did. And by the way, this is a playing card that was printed in the 1950s of American labor leaders. So that's one of the, I've never seen the deck, but I think that's an interesting image. And one of the things that Lewis did was just happened to be in the right place when this particular machine, the Alden Typesetter, was invented in 1857. This machine it has a wheel on it, and it has 154 keys. It actually is designed, those of you who know about type, you can see the type case up there on the left. And so it was actually designed to pull the letters individually out of the type case and set them in a stick. So that's the way it worked. Lewis, on a sort of a lark, started working this machine and set a huge record. She was setting 3,800 M's an hour, which is massive, over a 6.5 hour time period. So she broke all records, and was one of the women that helped to bring about a lot of bringing women into these typesetting contests that were going on, which is not surprising that, you know, that there would be these big sort of, they were meant to be sort of big macho show-off type champions, and of course the women would come in and beat the men every time, you know, because they were just really fast and adept at this, and so they sort of died out after a while, but because they were all these newspaper articles that say women beat men in typesetting contests. So Lewis did found the Women's Typographical Union in October of 1868. And she had 6 women at her first meeting, 11 at the second, 40 at the third, etc. So unfortunately, the union was short-lived because in 1870, the Typographical Union decided that they would accept women, and Lewis somewhat naively accepted their offer, and of course the result of that was that the Typographic Union would take women into the union, but only if they would be paid at the same rate as men. And nobody was willing to pay a woman at the same rate as a man. They would not hire a woman for the job if there was a man to do it, if they had to pay them the same. So it unfortunately backfired. But Lewis earned a lot of anger. A lot of people were very angry at her because they felt that that she should have not been quite so naive about that. We do, however, have many images of women in front of some of the very complex typesetting machines that we see at the time. I think we have to be careful how we read these images, though, because many of them appear to have more in common with, say, a car show today, where there'll be somewhat scant. I've never been to one, truthfully, but I've seen pictures of scantily clad women sort of draped over cars. Evidently, one of the messages with putting a pretty well-dressed woman in front of a typesetting machine is that it's so easy, even a woman can do it. So we need to be a little bit careful about when we see some of these images, whether they were actually translated into women working on them. However, certainly we do see women that are more and more working, again, mostly as strike breakers, but coming in and making a space for themselves in this field. So this says, these are two sisters that in 1882, Phoebe Hannaford wrote of them. They have made from $8 to $20 per week, have supported a widowed mother, have kept house handsomely, have given $100 to the Baptist church, and have saved $1,200, which is quite a feat, I would say. So that's we do see women moving more and more into this field inevitably as we go on. This is another cross section. This is a cover from the Scientific American. I need to thank Lisa Dunseth for getting me a good image of this. This is the American Book Exchange, and again a cross section. So what we see here is we see the division of labor again. So we see the women press feeders. This is 1885. We see, of course, many, many women in the bindery, and that's going to be very, very standard practice, that we're going to see women in the bindery. We're going to see here women in the bindery and then doing some simple burnishing work next to the engraving presses. So again, the simpler handwork. But then when we get down to the more formal binding practice, the finishing, and then certainly the printing, we're going to see men again in those positions. Women in the bindery are going to do the forwarding, they're going to do the folding, they're going to do the sewing, and men are going to do the finishing. I think. Oh, yes. I just wanted to show this slide on the left here, this man, because this was new to me. I didn't even know about this until I sort of deconstructed this slide. It says, the little caption underneath it says smashing. In fact, there was a whole job where men, in this case, or a man, took the sewn, finished book blocks and nipped them and tried to get the air out of them to make them flatter for binding. So there was a whole job that just involved pushing the air out of these books, which I thought was quite interesting, actually. All of these images that we see, these cross sections, are quite romanticized, really. I had read before that quote from the Bureau of Printing and Engraving. This is the way the shop floor looked. This is a photograph in the early part of the 20th century. Now, there are women on that shop floor and men, but you can see this is a sweatshop. This is not a pretty sight. Child labor was no longer in practice at this point, which is good, but we see that this is very, very crowded and difficult, and of course completely unventilated conditions. But nonetheless, we do see women. Here they're called compositors, but it claims they're making ready the presses. So we do see them moving more and more onto the shop floor in the early part of the 20th century, moving from folding the paper by hand to running a folding machine, which doesn't look much different today. And then again, of course, by now the typewriter is very prominent, and that has a very strong gender message with it. And so we do see women setting type at these monotype machines too in the early part of the 20th century. Here's a woman linotyper in 1920, thanks to the wonderful Louis Hine and the images that he does. And another woman working in a small, she's actually locking up a form, not setting type. But so we do see, even across the spectrum, we see women working more and more on the shop floors. Just heading back into the late 19th, early 20th century again, we still haven't, as all of this work is happening, we still haven't lost that idea that women need to be attached to something where they are both gainfully employed and employed appropriately to their class. And that's one of the issues that the arts and crafts movement was still struggling with 30, 40 years after Emily Faithfull did. So this is a picture of the Dún Éimear Industries in Dublin, which Elizabeth Corbett Yates was involved with. And these women are looking for gainful employment, but they're doing so by doing embroidery and lampshade painting and rug making and all of the kinds of things which are very lovely and genteel to do, but how many painted lampshades can anybody buy? So there were many attempts at creating these industries for women that would try to find them good, gainful employment. What did work, although it did not employ very many people, was the press again. And this was Elizabeth Corbett Yates, who was there at the hand press in her smock, managed to keep the Kula press together and functional for many years in Ireland. Of course, she had the advantage of having her brother William Butler as the foremost poet in Ireland, and her other brother Jack as one of the strongest illustrators. But the Kula Press put out many, many broadsides and put out many books that were reflective of the Irish nationalist politics that they believed in, and also were run by women. As we move into the 20th century, we still see women attached to the presses through their husbands and sometimes as widows. One of them is Bertha Gowdy, that many of you know about. Frederick Gowdy was the foremost American type designer of the 20th century, and he was very vocal about the fact that his wife did a huge amount of work with him in the shop, at the same time, of course, running the household, raising the children, etc. But Bertha Gowdy was an example of a 20th century woman who was very involved with the work that her husband was doing and very supportive of him. Another person that we have to mention in San Francisco is the very famous, or sometimes infamous, Jane Grabhorn, the wife of one of the Grabhorn brothers, Edwin and Robert, famous printers. Grabhorn collection is what's upstairs here in Special Collections. It forms the basis of the Special Collections upstairs. And Jane is known as an irrepressible printer under her little imprint called Jumbo Press. This is her Valentine, which is what will be printed in February for Valentine's Day here. The last lines are, and this has been an awful winter. Oh God, it's hard to be a printer. But I think we do sometimes forget that Jane actually had a publishing press that was quite serious, the Colt Press. She began it with William Matson Roth, who was from the Matson steamship lines. Actually, he's still with us. In fact, he's just moved back to Petaluma from New York about a month ago, and wrote a wonderful book about his time at the Colt Press. And Jane and Bill Roth and their third partner, Jane Swinnerton, who didn't last very long, did a whole series of books, very eclectic list, but they were very serious publishers during the late 30s and right through the war, actually. So you can see the eclectic list that they did, including some very books like Henry Miller's Colossus, for instance. They did some quite serious publishing. A lot of books by the very well-known poet and historical novelist Janet Lewis. However, at this time, exact same time, in fact, this is 1937, there was a group of women across the country who put together what I call a potluck book called Printing on the Distaff, Bookmaking on the Distaff Side. It was largely driven by Edna Bielenson, who was the partner in Peter Popper Press with her husband. And these women put out this little compendium of women in the historical tales of women in printing, among other things, and then some send-offs, for instance. There is a famous 19th century essay by a book collector claiming that women are the natural enemies of books, along with book lice and dust and a few other things, the rationale being that the wives wouldn't let the husbands spend money on books. So they did also some very funny essays about this, but they were really expressing underneath all this a huge frustration that they had only been able to get so far into this world of advertising, printing, and all of the related areas, and we're just held back from it, and we're trying to find a way to express themselves. They were very careful to donate all the money to charity, and they did 2 or 3 other books in this same way, which was that each woman just contributed a section, a signature of the book, and then they were all sewn together on all different kinds of paper, and they talked somebody into binding them and got Bruce Rogers to do a title page for them. Their frustration was understood because we've seen that women had been having some presence in the printing industries a little bit more and more as we moved into the 20th century, and yet here we are in the 40s, during and right after the war, and this is the Chronicle newsroom here. There's literally not a single woman on the floor running any of these linotypes, and that was the reality. They might have done them during the war, but as soon as the war was over, it was back to business as usual. So, in fact, it's not until the 70s, at the very end of the linotype era, that we start to see women that are more involved in doing this kind of work. But at the end of the letterpress era, we do have another kind of movement looking at letterpress and getting people involved in printing. Some of you will recognize some of us in these photos. This is from 1978. This was in the San Francisco Chronicle, and this is called The New Generation of Fine Printers. And of those images, 5 of the 6 groupings there were actually doing some form of letterpress job work during that time. My partner Cheryl Miller and I opened the first women's letterpress job shop since the Women's Cooperative Printing Union days. So it was 70 years after that happened. And in fact, I knew nothing about the Women's Cooperative Printing Union when we opened that shop. So we did see a new generation of letterpress printers taking on this now outmoded technology and finding a use for it. So it's beginning to be revitalized in the late 70s, the mid and late 70s. That was also true of offset, and we start to see women, even though they were not allowed in San Francisco to run an offset press in a union shop in the 70s and the early 80s. Still, this is 19. This is not 18. Okay, this is 19. But we do see more and more women running offset shops. We have a wonderful offset printer in our midst here today who can talk about that afterwards. But we also see women starting to teach other women how to do this. So Cindy Marsh was teaching students at the Women's Building in Los Angeles how to run the offset press, as other people were down there teaching women how to use the letterpress. So today, it's not at all unusual to see women running offset presses, but it was very, very unusual as late as the 1980s to see that. Of course, the other thing that's happened is that letterpress has moved into the academy, and this is our studio at Mills College, and this is we see that we're training a whole new generation of women and men to this kind of work in a different environment, in an academic environment, which was fairly new. That really didn't start until, in most places, until the late 70s and sometimes later. We have in this area alone, there are two shops that are very well known. I think Zita Borsich might be closing down her shop now, but she's had a very active print studio up in Mendocino for many, many years. Printing some wonderful, this is an invitation to a masked ball down there, and up at the top, I don't know if you can see it, but that's Jamie Lee Curtis and Christopher Guest's gift tags that were custom made by Zita Borsich, who's known as the printer to the stars. And of course, in Oakland, Julie Holcomb has had a wonderful letterpress business going for many, many years, with a focus on working with graphic designers, doing wedding invitations, doing this marvelous foil edging, and creating a really, really strong business and a very good business model for students. And in fact, she has also employed students and brought in student interns. Very recently, there's a whole new group called Ladies of Letterpress that has actually had its first convention, I think in the East Coast, in the South somewhere, a few months ago, and are actually revitalizing this whole idea of women's engagement with printing and with the printing trades, so that we have a whole new generation running these 19th century platen presses and doing very much 21st century work on them, and to create these new cards and wedding announcements and all the kinds of things that are creating that wonderful texture that we can only get with letterpress, and yet creating very successful business models at the same time. You've been a wonderful, wonderful audience. I thank you so much for coming, and I'm really grateful for the time this afternoon. Thank you.